It was a peaceful morning in Maplewood Heights, the kind of suburban neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly manicured, and each house looked like it had been plucked straight out of a catalog. James Parker stood on his front porch, sipping his coffee as the sun crept up over the rooftops. It was a rare moment of calm in his otherwise chaotic life. His older brother, Ethan, was finally on the mend after a brutal car accident 6 months ago that left him in a wheelchair. Despite everything, Ethan had never once let it slow him down. He was a fighter, after all, a newly elected state senator with a sharp mind and an unbreakable will. But that morning, the calm didn't last long. James frowned as he spotted something taped to their front door, another bright orange violation notice from the Homeowners Association. His heart sank, and a wave of frustration bubbled up as he ripped the notice off the door. It was the third one this month, all targeting the wheelchair ramp they had built for Ethan. According to the HOA, the ramp was an unapproved structure that violated neighborhood aesthetics. James crumpled the notice in his hand and stormed inside, where Ethan was already waiting, his eyebrows raised. Another one? Ethan asked, his voice calm, but edged with irritation. Yep. Apparently, our ramp is single-handedly destroying property values, James replied, tossing the crumpled paper onto the counter. Linda Harper strikes again. Linda Harper was the president of the Maplewood Heights HOA, a self-appointed queen of the neighborhood who ruled with an iron fist and a fake smile. She had an uncanny ability to turn the smallest infractions into major crimes. Overgrown hedges? Violation. Are trash cans visible from the street? Double violation. But targeting the wheelchair ramp? That was a new low, even for her. James peeked through the front window, and sure enough, there she was, Linda Harper, standing at the edge of her driveway with her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a clipboard clutched in her hands. She was snapping pictures of their house like some kind of suburban paparazzi, her lips curled into a smug smile as she scribbled something down. She's relentless, James muttered. It's like she doesn't sleep. Let it go, Ethan said, rolling his wheelchair toward the table. We've got the permits. We did everything by the book. There's nothing she can do. James wasn't so sure. Linda had a way of bending the rules to fit her agenda. He'd seen it happen too many times before. I don't trust her, he said. She's planning something. I can feel it. The feeling only grew stronger the next morning. James was helping Ethan into his car for a physical therapy appointment when he noticed Linda huddled with two men in suits near her house. They were pointing at the ramp, gesturing animatedly, while one of them jotted notes in a leather-bound notebook. Linda's face lit up with that all-too-familiar smile, the one she wore when she was up to something. I don't like this, James said, watching them from the corner of his eye. She's planning something big. Relax, Ethan said. We'll handle it through the proper channels. No need to escalate things. But James wasn't so sure. He pulled out his phone and started recording, just in case. It was a habit he'd picked up over the past few months, documenting every interaction with Linda, every violation notice, every suspicious glance. Something in his gut told him they'd need it, and his instincts were right. The next day, just as the sun was rising, James was jolted awake by the rumble of heavy machinery outside. He bolted to the window, his heart pounding. A bright yellow bulldozer sat in their driveway, its massive metal blade gleaming in the early morning light. Two workers in orange vests were measuring the ramp while Linda stood nearby, her red blazer practically glowing in the sunlight. She clutched a stack of papers to her chest like they were the keys to the kingdom. James's stomach dropped. He ran outside, his voice sharp and demanding. What the hell do you think you're doing? Linda turned to face him. Her smile was as fake as the designer handbag slung over her shoulder. Oh, good morning, James, she chirped. I have here an emergency order from the HOA board. This structure is in direct violation of community guidelines. It has to be removed immediately. James's jaw clenched. We have permits. This ramp is legal. The city isn't the HOA, dear, Linda replied, her voice dripping with condescension. And as president of the board, I must maintain our community standards. This ramp is an eyesore that's bringing down property values. The bulldozer roared to life. James's grip tightened on his phone as he hit record. This is illegal, he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. You can't just demolish someone's property without a court order. Linda laughed, a high-pitched, grating sound that made James's skin crawl. Notice was given 3 weeks ago via certified mail. We have the receipt right here. She held up a piece of paper with a signature James had never seen before. He frantically dialed Ethan's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course. Ethan was in a closed-door budget meeting today. James tried his assistant, his security team, anyone he could think of, but no one answered. Meanwhile, the construction workers were placing orange cones around the driveway, preparing for demolition. James took a step closer, his voice low and firm. If you do this, he warned, you'll be hearing from our lawyers. This is a violation of federal disability laws. For the first time, Linda's smile faltered. But the bulldozer kept moving. James's phone buzzed with a text from Ethan's head of security. Stay calm. Help is 3 minutes out. For the first time that morning, James smiled. Linda didn't notice the black SUVs turning onto the street, or the sound of approaching sirens. She was about to learn the hard way that some rules weren't meant to be broken. Linda Harper's expression didn't change as the black SUVs rolled onto the street, but James saw the way her fingers tightened around her clipboard. The construction crew hesitated as 3 men in dark suits stepped out of the vehicles, followed closely by 2 uniformed police officers. James crossed his arms, his pulse still racing, but his confidence rising. "You were saying, Linda?" One of the suited men, a tall, imposing figure with salt and pepper hair, strode toward them. Daniel Whitaker, Ethan's chief of staff. His gaze swept over the bulldozer, the workers, and finally, Linda. "Would someone care to explain why there's a piece of heavy machinery preparing to demolish private property?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Linda, to her credit, didn't flinch. "I have an emergency order from the HOA. This structure is non-compliant with neighborhood standards and must be removed immediately." Daniel raised an eyebrow and took the paper from her hands, scanning it quickly before letting out a short, humorless laugh. "Ms. Harper," he said, "you have no legal authority to order the removal of a federally protected accessibility structure. This ramp is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Your so-called emergency order is unenforceable." Linda's smile faltered. One of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, do you have a court order for this demolition?" Linda's mouth opened and closed. I don't need a court order. The HOA has jurisdiction." The officer shook his head. "Actually, you do. And without one, this demolition is a legal destruction of property." The construction crew, sensing trouble, started backing away from the bulldozer. Linda's face flushed red. "This ramp is an eyesore. It brings down property values. We have every right." "No, you don't," Daniel cut in. "And unless you want to be facing civil and criminal charges, I suggest you call off your little stunt." Linda's jaw tightened, her manicured nails digging into her clipboard. "Fine," she spat. "But this isn't over. The HOA has rules." Daniel smirked. "And federal law outranks your HOA guidelines. Good luck fighting that in court." The officer turned to the construction crew. "Pack it up, gentlemen. If you touch so much as a single plank on this ramp, you'll be held liable for damages." The crew didn't need to be told twice. Within minutes, the bulldozer was off the driveway, and Linda was standing alone, fuming. James took a step closer. "I warned you, Linda. You lost. Now, stay off my property." Her eyes burned with resentment, but she didn't say another word. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed off, her heels clicking furiously against the pavement. James exhaled, finally feeling like he could breathe again. Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "You handled that well." "Barely," James muttered. "She's not going to stop." Daniel nodded. "No, she won't. Which is why we need to be ready for her next move." And James had a feeling it would come sooner rather than later. James had hoped Linda would back off after being publicly humiliated. She didn't. The next morning, he woke up to find a notice taped to his door. "Final warning, your property remains in violation of HOA guidelines. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal action." James snorted. Unbelievable. He wasn't the only one she was targeting. By noon, his phone was blowing up with calls from other homeowners. "She's sending fines to everyone who spoke up against her," his neighbor, Rebecca, said over the phone. "I got a $200 fine for excessive lawn decorations. I have one garden gnome." James clenched his jaw. "She's trying to scare us into submission." "Well, it's working," Rebecca sighed. "Most people don't want to fight the HOA. They're afraid." James knew fear was Linda's greatest weapon. It was time to take that weapon away from her. James called an emergency meeting with his neighbors that evening. 15 households showed up, all fed up with Linda's reign of terror. "She's gotten away with this for years," an older man named Carl grumbled. "Nobody's ever pushed back. Because she makes sure people are too scared to fight," James said. "But she made a mistake. She messed with the wrong house." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. "So, what do we do?" Rebecca asked. James pulled up a printed document and held it up. "We fight back. Legally." "What is that?" Carl squinted. "A petition to recall the HOA board," James said. "If we get enough signatures, we can vote her out." The room went silent. "Can we do that?" someone asked. James smirked. "Oh, absolutely. And Linda knows it. That's why she's panicking." The petition spread like wildfire. Within 3 days, they had over 60 signatures, enough to call a vote. And when Linda realized what was happening, she lost it. At the emergency HOA meeting, the room was packed. Dozens of residents had gathered, and the tension was thick. Linda sat at the head of the table, her smile stretched thin, her grip on her gavel tight. "This meeting is out of order," she snapped. "This petition is invalid." James stood up. "Actually, it's perfectly legal. And we have more than enough signatures to hold a vote." A wave of agreement swept through the crowd. Linda's face twitched. "This is absurd. You can't just..." "All in favor of removing Linda Harper as HOA president," James called out. Hands shot into the air. Linda's face went white. All opposed. Only 3 hands went up, her closest allies. James grinned. Well, Linda, looks like you're out of a job. Linda's mouth opened and closed. You'll regret this, she spat, grabbing her things and storming out. The moment she was gone, the room erupted in cheers. James exhaled, feeling the weight finally lift off his shoulders. It was over. With Linda gone, the new HOA board rolled back every ridiculous rule she had enforced. The fines disappeared. The harassment stopped. And best of all, the wheelchair ramp stayed right where it belonged. For the first time in months, James felt at peace. And as he stood on his porch, watching a moving truck pull up to Linda's house, he couldn't help but smile. She was finally leaving. Game over.